and really glad to have you all here today. It is, what day is it? It is Wednesday. Yes, Wednesday, October 5th. Thank you. It's, my week started a day late this week because I was traveling, but great to see everybody here. It is October 5th, 2022. I'm Brett Nachman with College Autism Network. Really glad to have you all here. We have what I imagine will be a very entertaining and enlightening presentation from Brian Irvine. And so we'll get onto that in just a few moments. But as we do here in Canvas, in case this is a new space for you, I know most of you are returners, but we have these monthly presentations and meetings which enable scholars, researchers, educators, practitioners, self-advocates from all around the world to gather and talk about current research and new insights into the world of autism in higher education. We'll have a few updates at the start and then move into Brian's presentation shortly. Feel free to use the chat with any questions or comments. Again, as I mentioned earlier, you can turn on your microphones if you'd like to. We welcome your engagement. But as always, we'll start with a bit of an icebreaker. So many of us celebrate Halloween, or at least spooky things or fun horror, hopefully not scary horror. Maybe if that's your cup of tea, that's great. But the icebreaker for today is, what is your favorite thing about Halloween, or a favorite costume that you've worn in the past for Halloween? So favorite part of Halloween or past costume you have worn. So you can enter this in the chat, or you can share those recollections and experiences aloud.
As long as nobody tells the rest of my department, I'm putting together a Cruella de Vil outfit at the moment. So I've got wonderful Dalmatian stuff, that their hair's going black at the top, red ties and all that kind of stuff. Because I'm the only bloke working there, and they wanted to be Disney princesses, and technically she's a princess, I suppose.
Misunderstood villain would be my take, Brian. But...
No, she's definitely aristocracy.
Let's see.
I have a little lead up. I have a little lead up to my Halloween for this year, but every day since the pandemic started, I have sent my son a picture of an animal. It started with baby animals, and then we went into all sorts of themes. We've just finished up lizards. And so for the whole month of October, we are doing black and orange animals.
Thanks, Farah. That's definitely cool. Very, very specific too. Let's see what other folks have shared as well. Trail mentions candy corn. Eric said engaging in a different type of masking. That's very clever. Sounds like an article title, Eric. Kristen mentions I don't know who those characters are, Kristen. You might need to give some context.
It was when Chase was merging with WAMU, the bank. So we had giant credit cards, and we went to Northern Hollywood, and it was very popular.
Wow, fiscal costumes. There you go. My mentions running around to a stranger's house and asking for candy. Loves dressing up as a witch. Katie was a fairy godmother. From Cinderella. Sharon loves trick-or-treating and candy. Lee, Sandinista in the 80s. Yeah, trunk or treats for Jill, and transforming a car into a giant spider with fun sensory elements. That sounds awesome. Kathy says, attaching fabric softener sheets and old socks to my clothes and dressing up as static cling. There you go. Really clever. Apparently, I need to go. I need to just consult with all of you for Halloween stuff. Any other fun things related to Halloween? These are wonderful.
Tell us your favorite costume, Brad.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for throwing that back on me, Sarah. Oh, I haven't dressed up in a long while, but I did, not favorite, but I kind of did a Clark Kent Superman last year. So I literally didn't spend any money. I just had a black fedora, and I printed out a super Man logo and I put it on my black mask. So I had like the little emblem and I had a blue V-neck and I printed out an emblem. So that was my opportunity to embrace that superhero side. Well, thank you for sharing your contributions. I know it has nothing to do with the context of our meeting unless Brian's presentation is truly frightening, but it's always important to build a little bit of camaraderie amongst us all. And we have a few updates with College Autism Network, most notably. Our College Autism Summit is literally days away. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to our leader, Lee.
Yes, literally days. It's a week from today, we start the summit in Nashville. We're really excited that we got about 200 people who are going to be attending. So exceeded our goal, which feels like a little miracle at this in this era. So I'm assuming that anybody who's on this call who isn't already coming is not going to be coming, but you never know, maybe something falls through next week, you don't have anything to do. You can register up through Saturday of this week and join us in Nashville. The one other CAN related thing that I wanted to say is each week or each month on these calls, I see some folks that I haven't seen before. And if you are not on the College Autism Network mailing list, which you would know if you don't get our monthly newsletter, then you're not on it. And you'd like to be, just to kind of keep up with some things, please just put your email in the chat and I will add you to the mailing list going forward. It's a very low-key mailing list. I promise we don't spam you. Monthly newsletter, a few announcements here and there, but a great way to keep in touch. Thanks, Brett.
Thank you, Lee. I know I'm very excited about the summit and to see so many of you. And certainly for those of you who will not be at the summit, we certainly will further share insights and perspectives from the summit over our other programs, whether it be our program directors calls, the Canvas meetings, and other spaces as well. So we want to make sure that folks can remain engaged. At this point, before we turn it over to Brian, we have a space for folks to share any news articles, resources, celebrations. We celebrated a few folks last month who had dissertations that finally debuted. If there are any announcements or pieces of news that you think would benefit the group, we really want to create space for that. So this is kind of an open floor to anybody who wants to share anything, and we'll insert that into our minutes as well. Could also be sharing what you're dressing up for Halloween, but whether or not that's as relevant is up to you. Anything folks would like to share with the larger group? All right, well, if there's anything that comes to mind, you are welcome to drop that in the chat. I surely imagine we're going to have a lot of cool announcements stemming from our summit, not the least of which awards and celebrations and other things. So stay tuned for all of that. So let's turn it over to Brian. Brian Irvine, research fellow with the University College London. Also just very funny and clever as well, as we've gleaned. And yeah,
well,
Brian's
funny. At least I'm funny. We'll leave the other judgment for a little while, shall we?
Well, I definitely get a good vibe on that front, Brian. And yes, so Brian has been engaging in research related to autistic students in the UK. And our research presentation today will focus on the role of mentorship in higher institutions in the UK. So for that, we'll turn it over to Brian. If you have questions or comments, feel free to drop those in the chat. We'll allocate time during the latter part of the hour toward that end. But Brian, it's over to you.
Well, it's a real joy and a pleasure to be here. As was slightly mentioned, it's not the daytime for me. It's kind of gone into nighttime mode because I'm here in the UK. I'm going to talk hopefully for about 25 minutes or so on framing and reframing in something which we call specialist autism mentoring. It's a particularly UK-centric one, but hopefully a lot of what we do will resonate with your experiences and actually help you with the provisions that you're creating. So I'm Brian. I'm for the last 3 years, I've been a researcher in specialist autism mentoring in higher education at ACER, which is the Autism Centre of Educational Research at the University of Birmingham. I've now just started at CRAE, the Centre for Research into Autism Education. Basically, we've only got 4 letters and we sort of muddle them up every now and then. So I'm now at UCL. I'm actually there looking at the superior perceptual capacity that is found in autism, that whole people with greater sense of being, of the world, of experience, and so of beauty, but also of the ugliness of the world that it causes maybe little layers of trauma. So it's looking at that raw engagement with the world. And actually, for me, it's about how we create places of sanctity and quiet, calm, peace in not just our places of work, but our places of learning as well. For those of you who aren't coming through, well, I'm not coming through on the screen for you. Just a quick description of myself. I'm a bespectacled, bearded man with a passing resemblance to a kind of manic Santa. I've spent my life working first as a secondary school teacher, then as a primary school education teacher. I did some early years work, and I've now worked for the last decade in universities in the UK as a specialist autism mentor with probably about 60 university students as they've gone through their time. You see, here in the UK, there's national funding for some, I reckon, about 800 autism specialists who work in all of our 160 odd universities. It seems to be working. And it's working, well, actually, let me show you what kind of thing that we do. So I'm going to give you the words of Claire, who is one of our autistic autism mentors. She herself, she is a trained psychologist. She's a trained psychotherapist, and she's an autistic woman, and she works with our students at the University of Exeter. And she came up with this when I asked her what it was that this sort of cast of mentors, what we do. She says, reframing the student's experience of themselves as failing by some normative standard, and then inviting them to look at things differently, to think about what their values are, how awesome they are as they are, rather than consistently punishing themselves for not being good enough. It is that reframing the student's experience of themselves, that experience that they quite often come to university and they think they are failing. And it's how to reframe that so that they can actually engage with their studies. During my PhD, which I handed in last week, I've been really lucky to have gone through and asked so many people about trying to work out what this thing that we do in the UK, this specialist autism mentoring is. Before I get round to the details of that, just a sort of contextualize things where we are here in the UK. I'm going to talk a bit about the numbers of autistic students we have and their progression through. Things of success, challenges and barriers, which there's an awful lot of literature about that kind of stuff. And finally, hopefully wrap it all up with the idea of transformative action, of framing and reframing. Let's start with some numbers. Hopefully you can see a nice little arc of a graph there. So I went back in all the details in this. Right down in 2003, where we've got our first record of how many autistic students there were in the UK. There were 60 autistic students in the UK in 2003. Last year, there were 16,685, which is a huge growth. That's just what we now have more autistic students than we have students at Cambridge University. Okay, that just puts it in, and Cambridge is big. It's really big. So there is this growth. Actually, before I go any further, like many academics in the sphere, sometimes I get a little bit snarly about the whole idea of the neoliberal edifice of higher education. I don't like saying this, but it worked. Isn't that just a strange thought? Yeah, I'm not sure about the whole idea that we put value on education and it's become training rather than actually education, in the idea of, I don't know, the Bow intellect, that the whole idea that actually it's about the rounding of the self. But maybe it's because our autistic students have become a market that universities have been good for. Maybe it's just the time and the right place. I'll leave the interpretation of that for sort of question time and all thoughts. You'll also see, if we go back to our graph, that not only do we have this huge growth in students, but there's this little blue dot that keeps on getting bigger. So we now have about 2,000 postgraduate students who are autistic in the UK. Every time I go into a room full of PhD students and I tell them what it is I do, just on the way out, I get somebody coming up and going, Brian, I'm autistic. We high five on the way out. It's amazing. We now get these autistic doctoral students who are becoming the next generation of academics. And they're actually very comfortable with their expression of being autistic. And so it means that, well, I hope it means we're moving into a new phase of what it means to be autistic in our higher education systems. I think I can say this: if you are autistic, universities are moving beyond just inclusion. It's about belonging. No ifs or buts. If you're autistic, you belong in our universities. And I think that's quite a hopeful message out there. For completion, I can speak to the UK numbers. 85% of autistic students complete their studies. That's compared to 86% of the predominant neurotype and 79% of students who disclose a mental health need. Now consider, if you will, the overlap between autism and mental health. That actually means if we're getting 85%, we're doing something right in the support that's going on, which is quite nice. There is still room for improvement. Don't get me wrong. That last 1%, I would love our autistic students to be, showing up the majority students when it comes to these numbers. But it does mean we're on the right path. And part of that path is, over the last decade in the UK, we've had this thing called specialist autism mentoring that's been coming to fruition, that's been emerging. But this is in a sort of wider sort of national context. There are lots more stuff that's going on all across the world. So there are now 264 papers from 13 countries giving 106 different recommendations if you ever want to go and look them up. Only 8 of those papers were actually about this thing that we have in the UK, specialist autism mentoring. Now, for the rest of them, I actually have a paper that came out last month, 2 months ago, about a systematic trawl I did. I'll share that at the end. Basically, I read all the papers, so you don't have to. Now, specialist autism mentoring in the UK, well, we have student loans, but I don't believe they're the same thing that when you think of student loans. So our student loans come from, they're government backed. When we get to the age of 50, if we haven't paid them back, they disappear. I've got 3 years left. So it can't be a real loan if it suddenly disappears. Also, you don't pay it back if you're earning less than about £27,000, which means if you're starting as a teacher or if you're starting as a nurse, for the first 5 years or so, you probably don't pay back your loans. And it's only when you hit the threshold that anything over that threshold, it's 9% of anything above that threshold suddenly goes back. It's basically a tax that's named as a student loan so that we didn't scare the old people that voted Tory. this, when you apply for this disabled student allowance, you get to tick a box, and the box says, are you autistic? Well, it does this year. Until about 3 years ago, it said, do you have a social communication impairment, which is a crap way of putting it. But they've finally sorted it out. They now say, autistic box you tick. And when you do so, you are invited to go and see a needs assessor. And you sit down with your needs assessor for the hour and you say, well, I might need help in my lectures for note taking. I might just struggle with the whole idea of university. And they say, well, have a mentor. Or they may say, well, if you're dyslexic as well, then you'll have computer software for that. If you are visually impaired, there'll be reading software. If you have mobility issues, there will be things put in place at the university, and the university gets some funding so that actually everything becomes accessible. This is called the Disabled Students Allowance. And it seems to be working quite well. About 10 years ago, they started recommending for autistic students specialist autism mentors like myself. For students with mental health issues, they get a specialist mental health mentor. And for the last 2 years, we've started to get the first specialist ADHD mentors, but nobody's actually trained and nothing's emerged from that as yet. And that's my next job, is to make sure that that's going together right. Now, this is the weird bit. When you ask, well, we have Freedom of Information Acts in the UK, so I can ask the government whatever I want and they'll hopefully give me the statistics. Unfortunately, they're really bad at keeping the statistics. So I asked them about how much of this specialist mentoring was going on. And they didn't quite know, or that they couldn't work out within 14 days how much they were spending on it, or how much went to mental health mentors and how much went to autism mentors. What I do know is that this project pays for 7,000 and something hours every year of support that goes into our universities. It is an absolute gem of a policy. I think it's survived really well because of benign neglect from politicians. Doing my numbers and a bit of research. So I went and I asked all the universities about how much of this was being taken up. Only about half of all autistic students actually take up their mentoring provision. So half of them are doing really quite well, that they don't hit a point of crisis, or they hit a point of crisis so hard that they don't get the mentoring sorted out. So I think we've got something to do about making sure that when students arrive in our universities, they know that they can access this mentoring. There's a lovely study by Lucas and James in 2018 that says that the students find this mentoring really valuable. Unfortunately, I was one of the mentors that was interviewed for this paper. So I was reading through it and I came across the phrase, it's something like, it's all about making students bloody brilliant, isn't it? And I just thought, oh, that was me about 5 years ago. And now it's been written down in research. Oh, there you go. I call these woozle tracks. It's where you're walking around the bush and you keep finding yourself. Yeah, it's one of those things that I've just got to be a little bit aware of in smaller worlds. So I asked this, I've got some hot off the press findings, as in I only submitted them last week, because I went around and first of all, I went to autistic students and I said, what do you want to ask these mentors? And they came up with some wonderful questions. My favorite one was, do you listen or do you just, do you understand or do you just listen? And actually then asking the professionals, do they understand or do they just listen? Actually, the professionals started to be humble. And I think that was one of the key ideas that went all the way through, was this idea of humility. But I wouldn't have done that if it wasn't for actually the participatory research at the heart of this. I then went out to 60 odd specialist autism mentors and actually asked them what they did every year. I then took all their stuff back to a specialist forum made up of mentors, and I basically went through loads and loads of these diaries, all these things that had been written to me, and I found the things that I thought was truly exceptional practice, brilliant practice, absolutely amazing practice. Things like people arranging owl pellets to be dissected because they couldn't do it during COVID, or going for walks down canals, or going to a tap dancing lesson because the student wanted the sense of security of someone they knew. These amazing bits of mentoring, I went to the mentors that I thought were excellent and I brought them in. It happened to be that forum was an autistic majority in its own right. And they steered me and they kept me right. So that this has got layers of participation going on. From that, I'm going to share some of the results now. So first of all, these are the things that were, well, there are two domains. I'll come to the second domain later, because students and mentors talk about lots of stuff in their mentoring sessions. And also they do a sort of transformation during their sessions. But this is going to be the things they talk about first. You'll see that there are three colors of bubbles. There is the talk and discussion about success. There's the talk about the challenges that students face and the barriers. Challenges being the things that actually probably can be overcome. The barriers, they're the things that need a good kicking. I hope that's a nice definition. You can grow past a challenge. A barrier needs to be removed. Now, fortunately, specialist autism mentors, for the first 5-6 years of the career, we were only given one command, which was to remove barriers to learning. It's amazing what you can class as a barrier when you're bringing around change. It's brilliant. It's an anarchic profession. I love it dearly. There are some things still going on in our universities that perhaps should make us pause. And particularly, I think, the lack of understanding from staff. If you look at the sort of the red circle there was an awful lot talked in the sessions about other staff members who didn't understand the student. And if we're talking about the double empathy problem, if we're talking about two cultures, the predominant neurotype and the autistic culture, if they're meeting and not understanding, then actually negotiating our way through those is deeply important. And having professionals who are on the student side is incredibly important, particularly if we have a place of authority within the university, which probably about 2/3 of mentors do. 2/3 of mentors are actually employed by the universities. The other third are sort of floating private companies, and they don't seem to do so much of a good job. That they seem to be a little bit more removed, and they're sometimes told that they're not allowed to talk to other members of staff, which isn't about creating networks of stuff together. It's not perfect. There's good funding for it, but it's not a perfect system. Just to highlight maybe three other things. Firstly, on the successes, thriving remotely was talked about an awful lot. Now, I did do this research during COVID when suddenly we could do Zooms and all this kind of stuff, but there were a lot of autistic students talking about the benefits of being able to be at home, of being able to create their own sensory space, of being able to engage in their own terms. And part of that was about meeting other autistic students via virtual spaces during COVID. And we found that when everybody's come back, which but for some of them was only 3 days ago, but when everybody's back, we're definitely finding an upsurge in neurodiverse positive cultures in our university. There is a valuing of minds that think in different ways, and that is being made explicit. And I think a lot of I think everybody everybody gains from that one. Other things I want to say is that there's a big bubble that says academic challenges. Actually, having someone just to talk through an essay with, even if it's not their subject. So people would come to me and they say, Brian, I've got a biochemistry. I haven't a clue. My first degree was in theology, of all things. Yeah, but basically I count to 3 and then I give up. It's that kind of ability, though, to sit and say, actually, I don't know, please explain it to me. And actually explaining things to people who aren't sure what the right answer is a very valuable pedagogical tool. It's brilliant stuff. Lastly, it's the challenge of the social. Now, all students have a challenge of the social. Universities are full of other students, and not always other students are nice. That's the short version. But actually, for our autistic students in particular, there are more layers and more lamentations of ableist practice, of ways that they can be excluded, that actually having a regular fixture every week can actually do an awful lot of good for. This stuff about success, challenge and barrier, there's been quite a lot written about that. In fact, as I said, 200 and something papers. The more interesting bit I found was when students, mentors started to talk about how things were changed. And they started to talk about this process of framing and reframing. I think, and it is just a Brian thought, and this is, I think the downside about being the first person who studied this is I've got nobody around to go, Brian, you're wrong, take my model instead. Have a good old Barney about, that would be absolutely fantastic. That's what I want. But I think what's going on is that students have a diagnostic phase. This isn't the diagnosis of autism. I know language can get confusing at that point. This is how the students speak to power. This is how the students sit with their mentor and go, this is wrong with the university. This is wrong with people. This has been wrong with my primary school experience. This is the thing that is right with my relationship. This is the thing that is right with my tutor. They diagnose the social context. They diagnose the political context. They diagnose the economic context. They sometimes at times diagnose the theological context. It's looking at the world and saying what it is. They then, together with their mentor, they come up with strategies to deal with the things that are. They work together to fix those things that don't seem right. Lastly, and this is the particular job of the mentor themselves, the mentor has a job in motivation. To say that, you know, we've got your back. I've got, over the next 5 minutes or so, I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into these ways of framing and reframing, and then I'll hopefully wrap up at that point. So we'll start off with the diagnostic end of things. This I think is what's new about this research. It's about how autistic students overturn the challenges. It's not about them being passive recipients of the challenges. It's about how they get that, they get their advocacy boots on, and how they can go out there and they can do their march, and they can actually make sure that they can go to the people that are in charge, and they say, actually, this isn't right. A lot of that starts with the diagnostic process of what is wrong with our campuses, what is wrong with our institutions. And sometimes they are things that actually the student themselves can work for change. The student can maybe go to our student unions and gather other students together to talk about unfair assessment practices. Practices like having to sit in a room with lots of other sweaty, smelly people. That's not good. That's not helpful for everyone. Actually, open book, open world exams done at home have been shown to be really quite useful. At least from colleagues that I were talking to, these open book exams, you get a greater granularity. So yeah, your typical sit down in a row exam, students will sometimes just fail completely and write 2 or 3 sentences, and that's it, throw their hands in the air. At least with an open book, open world exam, they can then look at different resources and they can start to bring together their ideas. So you get a greater spectrum of marks. I don't like using the word spectrum out of context, but yes, so it's actually a better assessment program, as well as being better for our autistic students. One of the big ones in this is a neurodiverse frame alignment. And I was talking to mentors and mentees, and they would start to see themselves and their interaction within the greater neurodiversity of the campus. So this isn't saying I'm autistic, you're not, or in my case, I'm what's called an aphant. I have no pictures in my head. There are different kinds of neurodiversity, including I refer to it as students as the neuroboring. Those people in the middle that don't have any particular diversity at all, the great majority, they are slightly tedious, but that neuroboring, and actually seeing the whole gauntlet together of the campus population as a neurodiverse population in all its shapes and forms, and then being able to find your position within it. Neurodiverse frame alignment, you've got to know that that diversity exists before you can find your place in it, and that's part of what the mentors do. I would almost also say, I mentioned earlier the double empathy problem. Damien Milton's conceptualization of these two different cultures in negotiation. And there is something about mentoring as, this is where I get sociological, it's Goffman's backstage. It's that little place away from the eye of the public where you can practice putting on your different roles, you can voice ideas, actually have someone you trust to give you feedback on the presentation that we all elect to do. And actually from then you can then go out and confident in your own autistic presentation and say to others, it's not the fact that I'm misunderstanding you, you're misunderstanding me too. Let's sit down and sort this out. And it brings those people together by being able to frame it as such. Part of that, the going out there, means you do have to process anxieties first. You all know this, colleges, universities can be a fairly anxiety-ridden place. And sometimes an anxiety shared is an anxiety halved. Unless, of course, they're anxious as well, and then it's doubled. Yeah? But it's that kind of finding the way through it by talking through the week, which I put at the center of this. So that's the first stage. That is the working out what's going wrong. Then it has to be something about coming up with strategies for going out there, of engaging with the university in whatever way you see fit. It's about collaborative strategies. Mentors like myself, we see somewhere between 5 and 27 mentees every week. We get paid for it. We have that breadth of experience. Lots of us have done it for many years, and it means that we've had students who have talked to us about almost everything. There's a small notebook I have because, well, it's happened twice, but when they start talking about threesomes, that's probably too many. And it's actually then working through with them how to create the relationships from that point onwards. Students have a wonderfully varied life, and because of that, mentoring itself becomes wonderfully varied. We become deeply holistic. We are about creating a prosthetic environment for our students, one in which they can live their best life because there is those supports around them. Prognostic itself comes from the Greek pro and gnostic. Pro means towards, and gnostic means hidden knowledge. And it is part of this role of the mentor of unpacking the hidden curriculum, saying the things out loud that no one else has said up until that point, and allowing students to grow into themselves, to grow into themselves as full and rich people. As well as collaborative strategy, there's the developing of social understanding. This is not social skills. A lot of the literature out there says, I'm going to go very English here, it's a load of bollocks. At that kind of age, it doesn't work. It's not what students want, to be taught how to shake somebody's hand for the 27th time. What they want is a philosophical understanding of what's going on that they can then interpret their ongoing experiences through. The last part is also liaising with universities. Sometimes it's good just to have somebody who knows a university, who knows which buttons to press and which people to talk to and which people also not to talk to because they're a right royal pain. That is the first two bits. The third bit of mentoring sits squarely with the mentor themselves. We are taking on a role in which we motivate, and we do this mainly by sharing joy. I've had my knowledge of my students' special interests is huge. I love it. Even now, there's some of them, they're not been officially my students for 4 or 5 years. And occasionally I meet up with them in places like the Natural History Museum, and we go around talking dinosaurs. It's one of the best ways to live. If you're here and you're not autistic, find an autistic person that is willing to share their special interests with you, and you will see the world anew. There is a depth of passion and understanding that comes from these wonderful things that you really should get in on the act, just because it's brilliant. Part of this sharing of joy is also sharing the joy of being at university. That the fact that we get to study so many wonderful things is just amazing. We also empower our mentees, and we do so by creating relationships of trust. And hopefully we're you know, as well as we're motivating, we don't just go work, 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 because that's a rubbish way to live. That's a truly rubbish way to live. It's actually about creating these balanced lives. So motivational, it's not the pom-pom wheel. Wait, I've got pom-poms in here somewhere. There we go. It's not a pom-pom waving fixed grin. It's actually about the quiet reassurance of being at somebody's back saying, I've got this. That is you know, the three-part model that I've created alongside these autistic people. Interestingly, diagnostic, prognostic, and motivational, if you know what's called frame alignment theory, is how organizations like the suffragettes worked. It's a way of understanding, it's how Greenpeace has worked. It's about bringing social change, but it's not doing it with big groups. It's doing it in the minutiae, in the dyad of the mentor-mentee relationship. It also doesn't do classical mentoring of creating young proteges that fit a particular institution. It's creating mentees who are there to challenge the institution and to make the institution a better place for it. Mentoring of this kind doesn't, yeah, I mentioned neurodiversity. Don't get me wrong, mentoring doesn't need to shackle itself to any particular paradigm. I love the neurodiverse paradigm. I also have been in this world long enough that I know that paradigms change on a fairly regular basis. Hopefully, good mentoring isn't about getting students to fit paradigms or fit institutions. It's about creating the next generation of students and about fostering belonging in the academy. And that's perhaps why I think this idea of modeling, of mentoring, actually applies for more than just our autistic students. This is how we do good mentoring, whoever we're mentoring. I think of this as autism gain. The practices that we put in for our autistic students that are created with our autistic students and for and by our autistic students, they are actually, they bring betterment to our universities. It's autism gain, a lovely little idea. So you are all going to take on the mantle of mentoring at some point. And I'm going to urge you just at the end in terms of mentoring as social action. If you can exercise mentoring as reframing, you can all spot what needs changing. You can all create plans to make things better. And also you can cheerlead for your favorite people. Well, thank you ever so much for your interest. Slides and notes and papers and things are all available if you hold your phone up and you make it go ping on that QR code, or go to link.e/Brian Irvine and you'll find out how to contact me and more about this kind of stuff. And on that note, I'll pass you back to Brett.
Thank you, Brian. Absolutely fantastic. I wanted to see you deliver a TED Talk. Really love the visuals as well. I imagine we have, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I would love to do a TED Talk, particularly if it was in the States and someone would pay for my flight.
We'll see what we can do. Let's open it up to the wider group as far as any questions or comments you have. Certainly, Brian covered a lot of ground, but welcome further conversation on this. So feel free to either put a question in the chat or turn on your microphone.
I'll stop sharing, but I'll put the link in the chat as well.
And as we're waiting potentially for questions, I do see one that came in from Lee a little bit ago. Brian, can you talk a little bit about what the notion of a prosthetic environment is?
I will gladly talk about it, but I can feel the stress just appearing at the back of my neck. Now, you see, I'd finished most of my thesis back in March, and I went out and got jobs and all that kind of stuff. But last week I came back to it and I was looking at this idea of the holistic mentor being involved in all parts of the student's life. And I thought, oh, that goes with, oh, what's his name? Gyal, who wrote a book about autism, the Autism Matrix, back in 2010. And he talks a bit about the prosthetic environment. And I suddenly realized it came together with this holistic thing. So I added it to my thesis, and then I added the citation. Then the citation manager broke, and I spent 3 hours just before I had to hand it in, having to rebuild my citation database. I got so stressed. It's the first time I've pulled a muscle out of stress. So the prosthetic prosthetics are the things that help people function. These are my prosthetics. In the wider sense of things. And actually, we all need something in our life to help life go a bit more smoothly. Sometimes I talk about being cyborgs. I know that as an AFAN, I have no pictures in my head. I can't remember things like what my mum looks like. I can spot her in a crowd, but I can't tell anyone what she looks like because I can't bring a picture up of her. I always spot her, but I can't tell anyone. So I have a phone full of photos. I go, oh, that's my mum, that's my dog, that's my house. And it's just to help that other thing. And so I'm using my phone as a prosthetic. We also use our campuses as prosthetics. We use our campuses as places to meet, as places to engage with each other. So think of a cafe. That the cafe is a place where people can come together, and we know that there will be other people in the cafe for coffee. So we can actually, or maybe reading. And we can go there with some of our tools, like our headphones. So we stick our headphones in. And if we've got headphones in, you know, as well as being noise cancelling, they're that social signifier of leave me alone. So we take our headphones out and we make ourselves available in our context, in our prosthetic of the environment. We hopefully have some wonderfully comfy seats. And maybe the comfy seats will be in such an area where you can actually sit down on a comfy seat and somebody will sit next to you and you'll start the conversation. Or if it is a good social prosthetic, if it has been designed with universal design in mind, there will be little hidden places in the cafe where you can actually go and hide and be amongst people until you feel ready to engage. It's a way of thinking about our environment as things that bring us psychological affordances, that create spaces in which we can belong, be empowered. I hope that makes some sort of sense. Yeah, I've got a few nods there. Yeah, occasionally, sometimes when I start talking about, oh, I'm a cyborg with my iPhone, people just give me this wonderful blank look.
Thank you, Brian. Other questions from folks here?
I am very used to presenting and there being a sort of slightly stunned silence afterwards. It's brilliant. You should see me in real life. Oh.
No, we're all processing all this content. Kristen has a question, Brian. What kind of training are mentors and mentees provided with to help them change their institutions in lasting ways?
Kristen, I'm so glad you asked the question, because I cited your work so much. Thank you. It's like meeting one of your little heroes on one of these things. Go, oh, it's Kristen Caspilage. I had a little bit of a fanboy moment when I saw you there. Thank you. Brilliant question. So we have, well, this is the thing I get a bit grumpy about, because to become a mentor, a paid mentor in the UK, you only have to attend a day-long course with the National Autistic Society. That is the basics that you need. Hopefully, we're getting to this place now where a lot of our mentors have now picked up at least a postgraduate certificate run by a university in autism adults. That's one of our really sort of helpful ones, which actually allows people time to reflect on what has already been a practice for most of them. The good side about this sort of minimal pathway is it actually allows a lot of autistic PhD students and master's students to progress into mentoring, which actually will keep you financially afloat for a little while. It's a 0-hour contract gig, which doesn't give the security. Saying that, one of the mentors that was part of my project actually has a contract with a university. Oh, it's brilliant. Hopefully this shows us that the way that things are going to go. Then there is also one last requirement, which is every year to fulfill the requirements for DSA funding, you have to prove that you've been in continuing CPD, continuing professional development. It's called a level 6 one, which means it's slightly harder than an A level, or it would be content wise somewhere between high school and college. That's the kind of thing that it's laid for. And you've got to do at least 10 hours of it every year just to keep stuff topped up. Weirdly, doing a PhD on the subject, I had to argue my case that I didn't have to do any other CBPD because I'm bloody writing the stuff. No, it's part of it. It is definitely a model of mentoring which is more emergent than planned, I think is the best way to put it. And it's emerging well because of benign neglect. My worry is that some bureaucrats are going to get hold of it, and as happens, that just causes a nightmare. Kirsten, you're giving the sage nod. You know how universities work, don't you? Yeah, it does. Did that answer your question, or did I go spiraling off in a different direction?
That was perfect. Thank you.
Oh, Jill's question. Curious about Jill. Lovely to see you. There we go. Did you want to ask your question in person for those people who don't have the chat up?
Yeah, no, and I'm sorry, Kristen asked my question in terms of educational background. And I know you also mentioned at the beginning that you were looking into or interested in the mentoring of students with ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering about what potential similarities and then potential comparisons you see between mentoring those two types of neurodivergent students.
Okay, so backgrounds and then cross neurodivergence. So backgrounds of mentors, some of us are teachers, a huge proportion were psychotherapists in their own right. Lots were PhD students, usually from psychology or social science departments, which doesn't necessarily make them good. That they do get a bit medical model on us, and it's all very deeply social model. And in fact, one of the big issues that a group of mentors have is mentoring medics. So we have quite a few autistic medic students go through. There's a group for autistic medics that runs from the UK, autistic doctors, or autistic, I can't remember their actual name. But as soon as you say to a medical group, oh, I'm autistic, they get all medical about it rather than seeing the strengths, seeing the diversity, seeing the talents that you're bringing to it. And suddenly the whole idea of capacity gets in the way, and sometimes a diagnosis has to be hidden from just so the students can progress. And that's one of the things that mentors do. We're really good at running interference for departments and parents. Coming back to the second part of the question, which was about autism and ADHD. There is, as I'm sure you all know, that there's a huge overlap, particularly in the needs of sensory processing. One of the big things that I do with students with ADHD is I set a great big calendar event, which is just before their meds run out, because but the particular weakness or the particular but point of conflict for students with ADHD is forgetting to get their meds. Well, we've got the lovely NHS, it does all that stuff for them, but actually making an appointment, turning up, saying, yes, I would like these drugs. I know that they're sort of scheduled and all that kind of stuff, but I'll still forget to take them. It's something very addictive, and then it just doesn't. So actually we've got to change, I think, something about how our doctors do the prescribing thing to make that easier. I was very lucky. I was working at Royal Holloway, which is a lovely university, looks like Hogwarts. And we actually had a doctors in and amongst the building where I was working at. So actually, when they came to see me that week, we just at the end of my meeting, because I would have already texted the doctor or the nurse ahead, we would wander across from my meeting to the meeting to get their piece of paper that they could then take to their prescription and get it sorted. That was just one thing. ADHD itself, it's not about planning, it's not about time management skills. Just as I was saying with our autistic students who are fed up with social skills, rather than planning skills, they need planning understanding. How it is to create the flexible ideas that we have for basically surviving. There's also, I think, like the autistic students, the idea of a mentor who's got your back. Actually, ADHD students definitely need somebody who's got their back, who can say things like, yeah, you've left it to the last moment. You're going to do this in an adrenaline-fueled panic, but it will be all right because it's been all right all the other times, and I'll pick you up off the ground afterwards and buy you breakfast. Yeah, it's that kind of a very simple support which works with the student's strengths and with the students' anxieties and with the students' panics. And so I think there's an awful lot that sits between them both. The last bit is we have specialist autism mentoring, specialist mental health mentoring for our students who are going through mental health issues in the UK. It's one of the times I sometimes have frisson with other mentors is there is a very clear part in our mental health mentors that they are there to prevent relapse. The idea of preventing relapse into autism just doesn't work as an idea. So there's something there that doesn't tie the models up happily for me. And so I've got to do a bit more thinking about how those things can come together. Jill, I waffled on a bit. Was that all right? Oh,
I think
there's a lot of Kirsten hero worship in the chat.
Well, I think we are unfortunately nearing the end of our time today. Brian, yeah, I echo what others said in terms of the utility of what you have presented today. There's transferability really in the mentoring approaches, and you know there are certainly distinct, how should I put it, national contexts and nuances, of course, but I think what you demonstrated today was a real attentiveness to looking at the holistic nature of how to support autistic learners in higher education. So thank you, Brian, Irvine. Everybody, glad to have you all here today. We want to apprise you of our next Canvas meeting, which is Friday, November 11th at 3 p.m. Yes, 3 p.m. Eastern time. So we'll have Alan Olker and Tom Beeson from Clemson University talking about sensory inclusion in higher education, what that looks like. Please pass along your thanks to Brian. Yeah, glad to have you here, and glad to have all of you here too. So we shall see you in November for a future Canvas meeting, and we'll see many of you next week in Nashville. So hope you all have safe travels, a good rest of your week, and take care.
Look after yourselves. And particularly if you're getting together in real life, have a fantastic time. Just think of me because I'm on the other end of the pond. Look after yourselves. Bye.